It's not
Hi,
that
everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us today for our Mid-kaweah Sub-Basin Water Marketing Strategy meeting. The focus of today's meeting is discussion of a strategy being developed for the Mid-kaweah Sub-Basin that will later be used to start a pilot water market. We have presenters here, Matthew and Aaron, as well as Becky and myself from Stantec. We're going to start with a few housekeeping notes. We have a lot of folks joining us online today, and to make sure that we have both in-person and virtual translation clarity. If you're online, please look to the bottom right-hand side of your screen. You should be able to see a little globe. You're going to push the globe button and choose which language you'd like to hear, and then you're going to mute the original audio. That way you're only hearing the audio of the version that you want to hear. And for anybody who's particularly looking for Spanish, here are the same instructions. For the interpreters online, can you take a second to unmute your mic and introduce yourself so they know who they're listening to? Can you also switch over to the English side and confirm that everybody else has been able to hear you as well? So as far as comments and questions go, we're going to have a longer Q&A session at the end of the meeting. However, if you have something that you need immediate clarity on now, feel free to just raise your hand. Otherwise, we're going to pass around some comment cards. Feel free to write some notes, some questions along the way, and we'll take those from you around the Q&A portion, and we'll have Matthew and Aaron respond to them. We'll pass it off to Aaron.
Yeah, so thank you everybody for taking the time. Candriel covered a lot about why we're here today, but to go over what we're going to discuss with you folks today, we're going to have some welcome and introductions. We're going to recap our previous workshops and a lot of material, and then we'll get into an overview of the water marketing strategy and develop the progress, and then move on to the next steps for the water market. But as we get into this, I wanted to welcome everybody here tonight, and we really encourage you to engage with us. That's what this workshop is about. We want to hear your feedback, your thoughts about where we're headed, and then we would like to incorporate those thoughts. But first, I really want to thank the folks that are here helping us. First and foremost, our host, Self-Help Enterprises. Jesse, thank you very much for making this room available. It's fantastic. Makes me very jealous about our very tiny workroom. We do have some staff members here from our organization. We have Diana Zagara with Mid-kaweah and Tulare Irrigation District. We also have one of our Water Marketing Strategy Committee members here in person, Sophie Mulholland. But Sophie is extraordinary. She's like on every committee. I don't know which one. It's easier to name the one she's not on. Matthew Fina up here is our lead consultant in working on the water marketing strategy. He has a lot of experience on the coast with these things. He's an environmental economist, so he looks at these resources and he's helping us strategize how we do this safely. And then we have Craig Moyle and Candriel here. They're part of the Stantec team and really helped us guide and facilitate all of our discussions here. So with that, I'd like to introduce Matthew Fina. He's going to go over the recap of where we've been and
I'm not going to let you sit down yet.
Okay.
So the very first public workshop that we had was really presenting to the public for the first time the scope of work, the genesis of this entire effort, who the team members are, how the public is involved. And so that was really the purpose of we also did one other thing that I'll chat about in a minute, but the purpose was really to familiarize the public with the process that we were undertaking. And so we want to just quickly talk about, go back one again. The organizational structure and the committee members.
Yeah, so we had a very thoughtful organization to put this all together. We know that the water markets are something new. They're not necessarily widely accepted. So we had to carefully think through how to structure and make sure we cover all the beneficial groundwater in our subbasin. So we established a water marketing strategy committee that represents generally the public and the groundwater users. So there's 11 members. And it is directly feeds the 3 groundwater sustainability agencies with information and the strategy itself, but the individual boards will consider the strategy once it's complete. Supporting the water marketing strategy is Tulare Irrigation District as the grant administrator. We've received the grant through the Bureau of Reclamation. And then the 3 GSA managers are working together to oversee this process. Below that, there's a legal team representing each GSA. So our attorneys are all engaged in the process because we want to protect and ensure that we adhere to the groundwater rights that are existing. Off in the, can you take the bar off to the side?
I'm trying to.
Stantec has been contracted. They're the prime consultant on the project. And then we have an engineering team. That engineering team is there to engage with the water marketing strategy when there's a question that arises. What are the trading zones? What are the groundwater levels? We go to the engineering team and they return to the water marketing strategy with those answers. So that's the structure of the water marketing strategy. We go to the next slide. You'll see the actual members of the water marketing strategy. And again, Sophie's here representing the water marketing committee. I don't know if we have any others online, but this was carefully selected to represent all groundwater users. There's a representative for each use, as you can see, all the way from an ag to disadvantaged community, environmental, a water seat, industrial, and there's multiple, but we also looked geographically. We tried to make sure that we represented folks from all throughout the subbasin, so we're not focusing them in one area or not. So they've been together for now almost 2.5 years, meeting regularly. It did start during COVID, so it was a little odd starting out, but we were able to bridge that through Zoom and get our work done. But I would say this group has done some very thoughtful conversation. At one point, it was amazing to watch them. We locked them in a room and said, until you make a decision, you're not leaving this room.
And it was like 100 degrees.
Yeah, we locked them in a 100-degree room too. That didn't help. But it proves the point that this group came together under a common goal and objective, representing different interests. And what came out of that was the guidelines or the principles. And we've literally used those every meeting to understand what decisions are being made. And Matthew will cover that. So I think, am I on the next slide? Click into the screen. Oh, it takes.
All right.
So, yeah, no, I turn it over to Matthew.
Great. All right. So that's a little bit about the organization, the individuals that are engaged, the stakeholders that we're trying to represent, give voice to, and then the actual scope of work are the things that you see here. And so the very first thing that we tried to do as a group was to literally find out everything we could about what was already being done in other regions of the United States, other regions of the world. The idea was that we don't need, even though trading water is new to this region, we don't need to do anything that hasn't already been done successfully somewhere else. And so we spent a lot of time researching existing markets and strategies being employed elsewhere. That was actually a big part of the first public workshop, was presenting that research on all of those existing markets. Our second, based upon that research, the idea there was to create a menu of alternatives that the committee could consider for adoption here, consider for recommending to the GSAs for adoption here in the Kaweah Subbasin. And then we would develop specific terms, standards, rules and procedures for the very first, for sort of a test market. And we're calling it market version 1.0 here. You'll hear us refer to that a number of times. And that's because the goal now is to actually implement a test market here before the end of this water year. But this is really just a test. We understand that we're going to learn as we go along, and that we have tried to design a system that is adaptable, and that in fact will change over time in response to new information, right? So we've also designed a process to try and discover what's working the way that we thought it would. What are the unintended consequences? And then how do we adapt in order to respond to those unintended consequences, right? So that's the second bullet point. Another part of this body of work is analyzing water rights. and then actually developing a legal framework whereby the water market that we're going to describe to you today could actually be adopted by a GSA here in the Kaweah Subbasin. And so that means everything from just writing a basic understanding of water rights and how you can transfer allocation under the California water rights, and then actually developing all of the legal documents, administrative tasks, agreements, et cetera, a set of legal documents that the GSA could choose to adopt in order to actually implement the market that we've described. And then all of that is going to be put together in one document, which is that last bullet point, the water marketing strategy document. So all of that research, the specific outline for the rules, procedures, structures of the water market, and then all that legal documentation will go into one document that is the water marketing strategy document, which will then be given to each of the 3 GSAs for their deliberation, and they can decide to either implement or not things that we've been working on. So that, again, we're reviewing stuff. This is a review of what's been covered in previous workshops. But another thing we talked about was how the public can engage. Right? We want as much public engagement as possible. First of all, the committee, as you already heard, was chosen very carefully to represent all of the public and the water users, all stakeholders in the basin. But the meetings of that committee are all open to the public. So there have been 15 meetings to date, and we have had participants virtually, mostly virtually, but also in person. And any future meetings of the committee will be open to the public as well. We've also had 2 public workshops held to date, and of course, 2 public office hours. So we recognize that some individuals may be online and find it hard to communicate their thoughts and concerns and questions. We also understand even people in the room may not want to speak publicly. So each of our public workshops has been followed by a sort of office hour, right, where people can just come in a very, sort of open, casual, low pressure environment and can just share their thoughts. There will actually be the public office hour on May 30th at 5:30 p.m. That link there will make this presentation available, so you have access to that link. But that link is how you can virtually connect to those office hours. And some of the public feedback we've gotten has come through that channel. All right, so that was a big part of what the committee did. Now, in terms of, as the committee set about trying to work on that scope, one of the very first things we did that Aaron already alluded to, locking people in the 100-degree room, was to get them to agree to a set of guiding principles. The committee had to agree, first of all, what is it they hope to accomplish with this design for water market, and what were the things that they thought it was really important to avoid. And so you see here the guiding principles, which were covered in detail in one of the previous public workshops. I did want to share with you how we arrived at those guiding principles. We did an interesting exercise here. You see the prompt here is, what should the water marketing strategy accomplish? And then committee members and later the general public added to this.
Luego el público también añadimos.
We started to collect thoughts about what we wanted to.
Y entonces empezamos a colectar acerca de pensamientos.
Second, a vote for one of those. We also created, it turned out to be a small
También
of things that we felt very strongly we needed to avoid. Those things were then put together into this set of guiding principles that you see here: flexibility, adaptability, transparency, do no harm, equity and inclusion, and one basin-wide strategy. And then what was done is we took these guiding principles and we applied them to the menu of existing alternatives that were already at use in water markets in other regions. Now, we've deliberately made this slide small enough that you can't see, it's hard to see the content, but we covered this entire chart in a previous public workshop. But you'll see here, there's things like, what's the structure of the market? What is it, a formal market or an informal? If it's an informal market, how are transfers executed? What's the availability of price information? How are adverse impacts mitigated, right? And the committee took that menu and then applied each of these principles and chose what is the correct choice from that menu in terms of these guiding principles. And so once this was the hard work, was agreeing on the guiding principles. Once we did that, the choice of what the market looked like followed fairly naturally. Now, there's been one change from that previous presentation that we provided on the scope of work, on the research on existing markets, and on the guiding principles. And that is that there has been an acceleration in the timeline for implementation. So as you can imagine, last fall, there was real anxiety in the Visalia Basin around the availability of water. Seeing as we were still in the depths of the drought, we didn't know what was coming this winter. And so there was a strong desire to speed up that implementation. Did you want to talk a little bit about this?
Yeah. So, facing an imminent drought, November of last year, where all the news reports were 50% greater chance of dry February. The landowners and the interested parties said, you better accelerate this marketing strategy to give our landowners the opportunity to potentially balance the books, because we are also all administering groundwater cutbacks and allocation process. So we jumped into action and decided to move forward with an aggressive time schedule, at the same time recognizing that we probably weren't going to be able to get a fully blown water marketing strategy. So we're proposing a version 1.0. It's really important to understand that in developing this, we're not mandating a policy or principle. We're simply putting together a strategy, and each GSA can evaluate that strategy and take their approach and implement that upon it. So this is voluntary. This first version likely will be within a GSA. That's what we're promoting. It happens within the GSA boundaries and not across GSAs. And then lastly, it's important to remember that each GSP that does have a water marketing strategy within their projects and management actions will be considering this. So we can provide this document to them as guidance. I can speak on behalf of the Mid-kaweah Groundwater Sustainability Agency that we're very interested in making sure that we have this ready to go for our growers even this year, even though it's going to be a wet year. Implementing a pilot in a wet year can minimize the impacts, but give us the tools and the learning process where we're going to find issues and fine tune it. Again, keep in your mind, this is version 1. I might be ruining some of the presentation, but this is version 1.0 meant for various versions. As we learn things, we can adaptively manage a water market.
Yeah, and just to wrap up these comments about the change in the scope and the timing is that we're sort of breathing a sigh of relief, because in fall, there was this tremendous urgency. Get this thing up and running. We're going to need a market in all 3 GSAs by spring, late spring, early summer because of the drought. And we're saying, well, now what's nice is there's plenty of water. This is actually a much healthier environment in which to do a market, because there will be less pressure. There may be only a very small amount of market activity, but enough that we can actually test rules. How do they work? Is this thing functioning like we think it was going to? And do a better, more effective test. All right, so that is, all of that information is presented in much greater detail in the previous workshops. Craig or Kendriel, can you remind me how do they access the previous workshop recordings?
Go to the Tulare Irrigation District website, www.tulareid.org, and there's a water marketing strategy page off of that has all of the minutes, the videos, and everything you can.
Right, so there's a video of each of those public workshops, and then there's also, you can download and access the actual presentation slides if you want to look at those in more detail. What was your question?
You just answered the question.
Okay, terrific. All right. Yeah, so I encourage you, if you want to see the whole thing, or if there's even just one of those pieces that we touched on briefly there, revisit that, because that's all been archived. All right, so what I want to do now is just give you the update, talk about the decisions that the committee has made. And the reality is that a lot of progress has been made. Once we settled on those guiding principles, a lot of things sort of fell very smoothly from that. And so what I'm now going to describe is an outline for the rules, structure, and operating mechanisms for a test market that could be implemented by one of the GSAs here even this water year, right? This will be implemented for the October 1st end of the water year. So what we're talking about is a water market that will always have a program period of the current water year. So if this were implemented by a GSA before the end of the year, it would run until the end of September when the water year ends, right? And then it would need to be reauthorized for the next water year. So the program period is the water year ending September 30th. When we talk about transfers of allocation, we're always going to be transferring allocation in units of 1 acre-foot, right? But in this case, because of the way water use is monitored, we're measuring water use as evapotranspiration. So it's not 1 acre-foot of water removed from the ground or 1 acre-foot of irrigation applied to a farm. It's 1 acre-foot of evapotranspiration. And then the type of allowable trades are temporary transfers of a unit of allocation to be used during the current water year. Right? So the idea is that we're not permanently transferring water. No one gets the right to pump that acre-foot of water every year for the next 10 years. Whatever units of allocation they're purchasing this year is for use in the current water year, right? Also, we're going to, for the purpose of the test market, we're going to limit the total amount that a person can transfer off of their ranches to an amount that's equal to 10 inches per acre, right? So in many cases, someone might have, 2 feet, 2.4 feet per acre, but they'll only be allowed to transfer the first 10 inches, right? So the idea there is to limit the possible magnitude of unintended consequences just by constraining the amount of pumping or transfers that can be done. Also, if you're curious, that 10-inch amount actually is an outgrowth of allocation systems. The way that water use is allocated within each of the 3 GSAs, there's different buckets of allocation. The first one is native groundwater, and then there's tier 1 and tier 2. Again, if you're curious about those allocation systems, stay after, and we have a matrix of the 3 GSA's allocation systems. We're happy to walk you through that. But the native yield, which is equal to approximately 10 inches per acre, is a type of water that every single landowner in a GSA is allocated. So it's the amount of water that everyone has. And so again, that was another reason why we chose to cap the amount that can be transferred at 10 inches. Yes?
So this is only the allocation, but how about if we're recharging like on a wet year this year and you're over applying, so you're building up credits?
Yep.
So that credit theoretically goes into your water dashboard in the Kaweah subbasin. It shows up in your groundwater credits. Again, this first year, you're still limited to 10 inches. So you can pull it out of which bucket you choose, but we're limiting it to that 10 inches. That 10 inches corresponds, again, to the native yield, which we think everybody has. Over time, we would open that up.
So for example, if somebody recharged more than 10 inches per acre, they would still be limited to the ability to sell only 10 inches.
Only 10 inches, but my bucket would still be the full 12 inches of my recharge, but I'm only selling at 10 inches.
Yeah, and in fact, the various GSAs have carryover provisions, right? Unused. The nice thing is there's still an incentive to bank water because you can carry it over to future year. Okay. All right, and then eligible participants are landowners within a given GSA who have allocation. So essentially anyone who is given an allocation by the GSA would qualify, conditional on being current with all of their fees and then being in compliance with all agency rules and regulations, right? So those would be the eligible parties. Now, in terms of the type of exchange, how allocation would be transferred under the system is that we would conduct a series of monthly auctions where throughout the course of a month, if we were doing an auction, people could submit offers to sell water. Someone might say, okay, I have 10 acre feet that I'm able to sell. I'm willing to sell 10 acre feet as long as I could get at least $100 per acre foot. And they'll submit offers to the exchange. And we'll talk a little bit more about how those mechanics work. This is just a high 30,000 foot view of the exchange. People who want to buy water submit bids, and then at the end of the month, we match bids and offers, and money changes hands, and allocations are submitted to the GSA for transfers are submitted to the GSA for approval, and then people's allocations are updated in something in the accounting system, which is the water accounting dashboard. Now here, there's not necessarily, especially in early years, as we're going to do this, a need to do auctions every single month. First of all, auctions can't be more frequent than once a month because the water use reporting is only updated monthly. So it doesn't make sense to transfer water and then transfer it a second time before we've gotten updated water use data. Since that water use data arrives once a month, we're not going to do this more frequently than once a month. And we're actually imagining doing it even slightly less frequently. We would do it in December and January, towards the beginning of the water year. We would do it in the last 2 months of the water year, so August and September. And then the committee also is recommending that we do a true-up auction 45 days after the end of the water year. So the idea here is that we're using satellite remote sensing to estimate evapotranspiration, and that's how we're estimating individual water use. That data arrives with a 30 to 45 day lag, and it only arrives once a month. And so the idea here is that in some cases, water users who are submitting bids and offers in the January auction are actually basing their decisions on water use data that's 30 to 45 days old. Right? When we get to the very end of the water year, people won't even know how much water they used in that last 30 days for another 30 to 45 days after the end of the water year. And so this timing issue creates some challenges, in terms of people making thoughtful decisions about how much water they have left over, how much water they need. And so the idea here is to do one last auction 45 days at the end of the water year, where we're really truing up the accounts for the previous water year. And so that's a series of 5 auctions held throughout the water year. Now this is third-party facilitated, right? So there'd be an exchange administrator that actually receives bids and offers, does the matching, handles the financial transactions, submits transfers to the GSA for approval, and then makes sure that all of those allocations are updated in the water accounting dashboard. This is an anonymous market. So if you go back, one of the things that growers express some concern about, right, is that everyone wants to have equal footing in the market. They have just as much of an opportunity to benefit from trade as any other. And so one way to provide that, given different sizes of farm operations, sizes of allocations, right, different power dynamics, was to create an anonymous market where individuals are buying and selling water, but they don't know who the counterparty is. They can't refuse to participate with somebody else on the other end of a transaction. And a third-party exchange administrator makes an anonymized market possible. And then price information here, our goal is to provide as much price information as possible, both to market participants and to the public. The idea here is to have a market that's transparent, but also where the price becomes an important signal to water users about the balance of supply and demand, right? When the price is high, it means demand is high relative to supply and vice versa. And so we'll be making price and quantity information public following each of those auctions. Now, the committee thought quite a bit about adverse impacts, about trying to anticipate what are the ways that transfers of allocation between parties could harm third parties, right? People who aren't actually party to the transaction that's happening. So we thought a lot about what those unintended impacts are, and then tried to design a system to mitigate those, to be proactive, not wait until we discover those consequences, but actually have a set of rules that would mitigate those. And so we have a series of triggers, one related to groundwater levels and one related to water levels in shallow municipal wells, especially in the area of disadvantaged communities, where those triggers should they be crossed, would actually result in restrictions on trade, right? And this is a proactive approach. So in the minimum threshold trigger, if water levels get within 12 feet of the GSP designated minimum threshold, restrictions would be imposed on trading, right? And 12 feet is about 1 year's water use under normal conditions. And so this idea is we would restrict trade a full year before we really run into trouble. And then the engineering team is working right now to provide guidance on which are the shallow municipal wells that we're going to monitor closely, and then what are the well-specific thresholds that we will monitor for before trading restrictions are imposed. So now the way that works is this. So there's two sets of lines here that matter. Like you'll see here at the top, if you look at 11, which is that zone up in the top center top, you'll see a curving yellow line around it, sort of a smooth yellow line enclosing 11. So in the groundwater sustainability plan, the GSP, these are what are called analysis zones, right? And that yellow line was created because it roughly follows some kind of hydrologic contour, right? A groundwater level or something. And that's why it's smooth, right? We took those existing analysis zones, which are used in the GSP, and we actually clipped those to the actual parcel boundaries. And so the red line you see there is actually, it follows as closely as possible the yellow line, but it snaps to the specific land parcel boundaries. And those create trading zones. And so now 11, trading zone 11 is the area inside that red line, that irregular red line around 11. Right? Now within each of those trading zones, we are monitoring for the minimum threshold trigger and for the disadvantaged community trigger. So to give you a sense how this works, if we just look, this is Mid-kaweah, the green squares that you see here. These are trading zones 28, 29, 30, and 31. And we would be monitoring for the minimum threshold trigger and the disadvantaged community trigger in each of those trading zones. Now, as long as water levels are sufficiently high to support normal use of small municipal systems, and as long as water levels are sufficiently high above the minimum threshold designated in the GSP, trading would be allowed between any of those four trading zones. So someone who has a parcel in 30 could trade allocation with somebody who has a parcel in 28, all right, in each of those monthly auctions. Now, if a trigger is crossed in trading zone 30, restrictions on trade would be applied to all of the parcels in 30. Now, in the case of the minimum threshold trigger, if water levels fall within 1 year, approximately 1 year of the minimum threshold, there would be a directional restriction on trade. And parcels inside 30 could transfer pumping out of 30 because that would reduce the total amount of water use and would support sustainable management. But no parcels are allowed to transfer allocation into 30, right? So we will not allow the market to increase the total amount of pumping that happens in 30 if that minimum threshold is crossed. Now, in the case of the DAC trigger, it's even more aggressive. There's an even stronger level of protection for small municipal systems, and that is that if one of the small municipal systems that we're monitoring gets within whatever that we cross the threshold, where we're worried that within a year they could suffer adverse impacts of transfers, trading would cease in 30 altogether until that impact can be mitigated, right? So there may be ways that the market participants in the neighborhood of that disadvantaged community could purchase surface water transfers, recharge. So there's a number of ways that impact could be mitigated. And upon mitigation, then the restriction could be lifted. So these trigger levels are monitored twice a year. The one that matters for us would be the fall reading. So if any of and we'll show you a map in a little bit of the various representative monitoring wells, but in each of these wells, if that trigger reading will be taken in fall, we'll actually have all of that information publicly available and communicated to the public in December before the first auction. So we would know in December before the first auction whether we needed to impose trading restrictions in any of these zones, right? And then triggers could be lifted following the spring reading, or again, anytime if growers are able to mitigate the impacts to disadvantaged communities, right? And so here's a resource that we have available. I realize that this, so this presentation will be posted as a PDF, and in that PDF, this link down here in the bottom left corner will be an active link. You can click on this and it will open an interactive map that I've taken a screenshot of here. And so there's some important things that we would like you to spend some time looking at this map and considering and thinking about. So first of all, one of the important layers, you can see here, some of these layers are turned on, some of these are turned off, right? There's actually the DAC layer, disadvantaged community. This gray hash mark shows the location of disadvantaged communities, including, Okieville, Wakena, and then ones all over all 3 GSAs, right? And so that's an important bit of information. One of the other layers that's here is the reported dry wells, right? So these are self-reported to DWR. So one of the layers you can click on is you can actually look to see what are wells that are reported dry today, right? And where are they located relative to these disadvantaged communities? And so there's also one other layer that's been added very recently, which is we now actually know in each of our representative monitoring wells how close groundwater levels are as of the spring reading to the minimum threshold. And so we really encourage you to spend some time with this map, looking at all of that information, and then reaching out to us with questions, public comments, feedback, because this is a pretty cool tool. So any questions about that at this stage? All right.
I have a question, Matthew.
Please.
Just to clarify, the monitoring wells are monitored on an ongoing basis year round, and you're just looking for the triggers at the fall and spring intervals?
I believe the representative monitoring wells are only read twice a year.
Oh, okay. I missed that.
Yeah, we read them across the board throughout the state twice a year, spring, fall. It generally corresponds to the Bureau of Reclamation schedule, which is spring is represented by actually January, February. We try and get out there, and fall is usually September, October time period. So you're trying to capture the pre-irrigation levels, and then which we call actually the rebound, because it's coming off the fall irrigation run. So now, one of the things that we're throwing into the mix this year is we're going to put an interim reading in the middle of summer, because we want to see the timing of the various levels. I don't know if that helps the water market, because the group really deliberately picked that fall reading because that's going to be the worst case scenario. So you're targeting and making decisions on the worst case scenario.
Yeah, that makes sense. From the market standpoint, that makes sense. But I also love the idea of having a midsummer reading too, just for knowledge sake.
Yeah, just for, we don't know the timing of this massive recharge that we just went through. So as generally speaking, we know it shows up in fall, but what's that time? Like if we put X amount in the winter, what do we get in the middle of summer? We do know in our little footprint, there won't be any pumping. Unless we really mess up and aren't able to deliver the surface water, most likely everybody will just use surface water all year round this year. So again, that's the baseline, no irrigation pumping. What does the groundwater levels do?
So that gives you a really nice, clean
Correct.
association between the recharge and what you find.
Yeah, I haven't had one of those in a long time.
Cool, thank you.
Just, too, what I'll do is when we have a sort of delicate Zoom ecosystem here. I'm afraid to jump pages from one to another and blow the whole thing up. So when we get to the very end of the Q&A portion, I'll open that link and actually we can click around that map. It's a pretty cool tool that the committee, and this was set up by the engineering team at the Water Marketing Strategy Committee's request. So this was information they felt they needed in order to make thoughtful choices. All right, so that's sort of the basics. That's how the market will work. Now there's some additional details and function that are being built so that all of this can be implemented if the GSA chooses to do that. So one of these things is called the transfer bucket. Now, before we do that, I want to show you this, right? So this is the water accounting dashboard, right? So each, landowners can create an account in the water accounting dashboard, which is a grouping of all of their commonly owned or operated parcel numbers, right? So there would be a column of APN numbers. And then what you see here is they can actually see what their allocation is for each parcel, right? And we also know what the acreage is. That'll become important for that 10 inches per acre. And then they get to see things like what's their total evapotranspiration on that, it's parcel specific, right? How much precipitation happened, and then what's their allocation? How much water do they have used? And then of course, all that's used to calculate a balance. How much water do they actually have left for use in their allocation this year, right? So everything that you see here, except for the green column, currently exists. And water users have access to this data. And again, it's updated every 30 days. Now, we're proposing the creation of a new feature called the transfer bucket. Here it will say available for trade. And this is where an individual who is interested in selling water can actually choose available allocation from one of their parcels, and they can move it into the available for transfer column. Now, the water accounting dashboard, if a GSA adopts the water market structure, the function will actually work so that, first of all, this amount, the amount here, cannot exceed 10 inches times the number of acres, right? So that automatically, the dashboard would not allow them to put more allocation than that into the available for transfer column. And it also would not allow them to put more than their balance, right? So it might be that they have less than 10 inches left, right? We don't want them to sell water they don't have. And so that's the available for transfer column, right? Now, the way that would work, here it is sort of conceptually, is that a grower has a series of APNs, each with their own allocations. A grower would first establish the amount of allocation they have available to sell, or at the same time may decide how much they need to buy. But in the case of a sale, they would move the allocation from the specific APN into the transfer bucket, right? And again, functionally, that would just mean moving it into the column in the water accounting dashboard, right? The dashboard verifies that it's not more than 10 inches per acre, and it's not more than their available balance, right? So conditional on those two being met, that amount goes in the transfer bucket. And then the water accounting dashboard is actually talking to water trading software, right? And so the water market exchange administrator immediately sees how much water the individual has available for trade in each of those APNs. In trading software, right, that's integrated into the water accounting dashboard, the owner in this case can submit offers to sell, right? And again, the water accounting dashboard and the exchange software are talking to each other, right? And then the exchange administrator at the end of the month would match bids and offers, would report the matching to the individual parties, counterparties, would collect payment from the sellers, transfer the payment to the buyers, would submit the transfers to the GSA for approval, and then would actually update allocations in the water accounting dashboard. So that water that was in someone's transfer bucket would be moved out, debited from the seller's account, and would actually be added to the buyer's account in the water accounting dashboard. Excellent. And then that buyer can move the allocation from their transferred column back into specific APNs for water use. All right. So that's
Matthew, really quickly, maybe an important point is that when we talk about the water dashboard, it's live, it's being used. When we talk about the transfer bucket, it's being developed and incorporated in the water dashboard. And we talk about water market, that software package, that's an existing software package that the committee has evaluated. So it's not theoretical.
Yeah.
It is it is a real, we're stitching it together as we speak right now.
But it's voluntary. A GSA has to decide to
Correct.
implement it. And
They
offer
can
it.
turn that on the water dashboard if they want, or they could leave it off. So,
Another question. If one of the zones are under restriction, from a trigger.
Yeah.
Is that transfer column disabled?
No, because, well, so in the case, great question. So in the case of a DAC, yes, the answer is yeah. If it's the DAC trigger, they would not be allowed to offer water for sale. If it's a minimum threshold trigger, they can move it into the column, but it would restrict who they can sell it to. So you can sell it to someone else in your own trading zone. You just can't transfer it to somebody else. You can sell it to someone in your own trading, or you can sell it to someone outside the trading zone. But on the buy side, right, it actually restricts buyers more. Buyers will not be able to buy allocation from someone outside the trading zone. And all that's already built into the water market software. The software is already it's in use in another market with similar trading restrictions. And so the software handles that automatically.
there's a question, well, and it's a very good one. I think we need to ask our attorney, is the money received taxable? How is it reported?
Yeah, so that is a question for
Attorney.
No, I was actually for an accountant, right? But yeah, and so that's interesting. I can ask how that's treated in other markets. My assumption is that the answer is yes, right?
Yeah, it's income.
Yeah.
It's gotta be.
Yep.
Thanks, Courtney. We will make sure, that's why we have these public workshops. It's a good question.
So there's one other recommendation in the current iteration for version 1.0. And that is the recommendation for a review committee. And so the idea here is that this would be a subset of the members of the strategy committee. So it would be a smaller group. It would have a GSA representative and then a representative of each of the three water use categories, ag, environmental, and your disadvantaged communities, each of those stakeholder groups rather. And that the idea here is that there would be a group who was involved in the design and implementation of this thing, who was regularly evaluating progress and deciding, is this thing working like we intended? Identifying what are the things that we didn't intend? What are the surprises? What's the new information that's become available? And then importantly, what are the suggested policy changes that should result from that? So the idea here is that the review committee would meet at least semi-annually, but could also be called upon if issues arise, that the group would evaluate market performance and suggest policy adjustments, also weigh in on if there's any disputes within the market. And that one of the suggestions we heard earlier today was that they actually put together a formal report that is presented to the GSA that evaluates what, it's a summary of what happened this year, how many triggers, if any, were pulled, what were the restrictions on trade, what did we see in terms of transfers, where did water transfer, were there any surprises, and then have written policy suggestions, right, that would be incorporated into any future authorization of the market. It's really important here to understand that the review committee, as the committee is recommending it, just has an advisory role. This is a set of recommendations that would be made to the GSA board. And it's the GSA board ultimately that authorizes the market and would make any policy adjustments over time. So any questions so far about the sort of basic structure and operating mechanisms, how this thing works? Terrific. All right, in terms of what the committee is doing next, in order to make it possible for a GSA to implement a pilot market this year, the engineering team is working on triggers, in particular the DAC triggers. So the engineering team has already done some really good work identifying which representative monitoring wells are either already below minimum threshold or are within 1 year of minimum threshold. And they are working now on identifying the small municipal wells that we're worried about and what the individual thresholds will be. The legal team has some heavy lifting in terms of final documents, actually putting together a draft resolution that a GSA could use to adopt water market. a formal set of rules and regulations, and then important agreements, participant agreements. What does a participant in the water market agree to, right? And then what are the responsibilities of the exchange administrator? So that's the next step as well. And then the Stantec team is working on finalizing all of that. That entire scope of work that you saw outlined at the very beginning, and then each of these individual pieces. And the goal is we're working heavily on finalizing this in the month of June, basically. And then there's also work underway to integrate, to make these changes to the Water County dashboard so that it can be integrated with trading software should a GSA choose to turn that key. As I mentioned earlier, we have public office hours, 5:30 May 30th. That link will be available in this link here for those of you in the room. The presentation will be live on the Tulare Irrigation District website to access that. And then now, before we jump to broad questions, I'm going to risk breaking the system.
Aaron, what would be some of the responsibilities that GSAs have as they consider adopting the framework? Like,
Yeah.
like public workshops.
I think that's important. So the way we built it right now, obviously, it'll go under consideration by the boards. So there'll probably be a public meeting to, effectuate this policy. There'll be a board resolution and that sort of thing. But the follow-up through that program is really that committee, and we do envision as we move along through the system, there would be check-in points as we move along, especially moving into the end of the first training period. So there's a committee that we would like to establish, and they would kind of look back and see, okay, how did things go? And do we need to make policy recommendations for the change? That goes all the way back to the board. So there's multiple check-in points as we move along. So hope that answers it. We're kind of building it as we move along, so there's no guaranteed answer on anything, but we do have check-in points as we move through.
Cool. Okay.
Aaron, so you talked about a limited 10 acre inches to start out with. But is your plans to increase that, like in additional permits?
I envision it, but again, we want to see how it operates. It may be that people aren't even using the 10. So we wait to see, and then Craig and I have worked on, we're looking in the Mid-kaweah, there's going to be a feedback loop with the growers, and so there'll be active surveying. Well, how are you using it? How are you viewing it? Is the 10 inch, that's a good question. Is the 10 inches too small? Do you need more allocation, capacity to move? And then the boards will evaluate those. And again, we have this feedback loop where we say, okay, will we allow 10 inches of water per acre to move? How did that play out across the landscape?
Well, maybe it's helpful to talk about what the 10 inches is in relationship to the Water County dashboard, because in the Kaweah subbasin, there's 3 buckets, and each bucket has 10 inches. So the native is perceived as being this essentially the sustainable yield of what is returned for the full benefit. Then the next bucket is essentially your they call it salvage water, and that's water that's held in storage in Kaweah. Okay, so that's your surface water that's being used, but it also becomes part of that groundwater aquifer. Then there's the foreign supply, which is your CDP imports. So when you talk about adding more water, it's getting access to that water that's connected to the other buckets.
Okay, but they're not connected right now on version 1.0.
Not in the market.
Not in the market.
And actually, there's also it allows us, one of the admonitions that I got designing another water market from someone who did markets in Nebraska and Colorado was, these are very complex, right? That you're going to discover new things every time you turn around, right? So start simple and create a system where you learn over time and add complexity. And so some of this is purely for the sake of doing something that we know we can implement that's simple, and frankly, where we mitigate potential unintended impacts. But there's a challenge with some of these surface water, which is there's place of use restrictions. So if we trade more than 10 inches, right, we now have to actually make for certain we know which bucket you're trading water out of. Because if it's coming out of the foreign water, there's restrictions on who you can transfer that to. Right? Are they a rate-paying member of the that, are they paying fees to support the infrastructure that's delivering that water, right? And these place of use restrictions become really complex really quick. That's just one example where there's just layers of complexity. By saying 10 inches, we're essentially trading native water. We don't have to worry about that issue now. We can deal with that later after we have some confidence that this is working the way we intended, and that we have a sense of what, how this thing works, who uses it, where the water goes, and we can start adding that complexity. Yeah.
We also have to take into consideration what's happening every year with the native yield, because the whole point of Sigma is to get to sustainability. And you can't do that if you just continue to use more and more. So we've tried to do tiers to make it so that it doesn't hurt right now, but you can't be selling water that you don't have or that doesn't exist.
Right.
Yeah, that's a good point, Sophie. The native yield is what we call in the Kaweah subbasin is a negotiated native yield. So it's not a traditionally determined native yield where we calculated the average. We calculated the average and then said, that's really not enough for some folks to even survive on or to realistically try and do something. So it was negotiated into 10 inches. So those surface water users that had water in certain areas added it to the bucket and got it up to 10 inches. Then we entered a drought. So that calculated average of all the water that was applied to that 10 inches is shrinking. So good point. Will the number change? Yeah, it may go up, but it may go down. So,
Okay.
yeah.
I think the question was really if other waters were going to be added. You guys answered that.
Yes.
And
Yes.
do you have a roadmap of when those additional waters will be added? No?
And my own experience doing this elsewhere is this takes much longer than you ever imagined, right? The learning process is slow.
So the trading would be more within the irrigation district itself, the traditional way of doing it, as compared to the water market.
Well, my estimation is there's going to be people that really they want to do something with their credit or something. They're not going to want to do a lot of fuss and setting up and transfer it. And they're going to actually just literally go to the water dashboard one evening and say, I'll put 50 acre feet in the water dashboard and I'll put it out there for some absurd price. And it just might pair up with a buyer because somebody who's in trouble and looking for, I'll put 50 acre feet, looking for 100 acre feet. At least they could get the 50 acre feet out.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure there'll be a few of those happening even this year to a certain extent. The more likely that I think is going to happen this year, because I've already talked to some growers about it, we did so much recharge in the months of January, February, March, that by the time they got their irrigation bill and realized how much they put in the ground, they got the bill for that water and realized that it was really expensive. And now they're thinking, well, I went overboard. And then there were a couple other growers that didn't do any recharge. And now they're coming going, well, I didn't get a chance to do it. Well, sorry, too late now. I mean, now you're going to have to buy even more expensive water. So we've told them, if you wait for the market, you might, you'll be able to pick up some extra recharge water through the market. So they're not buying it because they have a need right here and right now. They're going to buy it, put it on their books and hopefully use it. Heaven forbid we end up in another drought next year. But that's the idea, kind of where we're reducing and then spreading out the excess. I hope that kind of makes sense.
And we did hear today that Greater Kaweah does have a fallowing program. So that's where someone can agree to essentially sell all of their allocation. They're going to forego water use and fallow. So in different basins, there may be multiple tools.
But that's not a buy fallow that's a program that's happening within a GSA, not like I can't fallow you out for a price. So, and I get the credit, you can't do that.
Yep.
Okay. There's a question online, and it's a good one. It says, is that 10-inch max available to trade 10 inches per acre of the person trading or the 10 inches per acre of the person purchasing?
Nope, great question. It only applies to the seller. So they could buy 10 inches from one person, 10 inches from another. Also, they could buy, say they have 100 acres, they could buy 10 inches off another person's 200 acres, right? So the limit applies to the seller.
Thanks, Dave.
So I did want to show you this again, just to encourage you to start using this. But what you see here, so the only 2 layers we have turned on here are the disadvantaged communities, which are the gray hash marks, and then you see the reported dry wells. You can actually literally click on the dry well, and it'll tell you what year, what date it was reported dry. It'll tell you whether it has been resolved or if it's still dry, right? So there's a lot of information embedded in this. Our interest was in seeing sort of where the hot spots were, and in particular where those dry wells were close to designated disadvantaged communities, right? So that it's the incidence of those 2 that we're particularly concerned about, where those, and so we do see, if I zoomed in, there's 6 or 7 around Oakeyville, for example. Another layer in here that's really interesting. I'm going to turn that off now. Turn on this one. Right. So what this shows. There it is. Right. So this is where the engineers looked in each of the representative monitoring wells. So a representative monitoring well can be a triangle, an X, or a circle, or a square, depending on the status of when the spring reading happens. But what matters here is in the case of these green circles, right, the size of the green circle actually indicates how many feet above minimum threshold the representative monitoring well is. So if I come down here, you'll see, right, so the size indicates some of these are 200 feet above minimum threshold, right? Some of these are 0 to 20 feet. Remember, what we care about is 12 feet. That's about 1 year water use. And so there are 8 of these representative monitoring wells that are within 20 feet of the minimum threshold as of the spring reading. And then, of course, you see there's about 9 of the red triangles, which means that the representative monitoring well is currently below minimum threshold. So that means about 17 wells of all the representative monitoring wells would have a trigger today if the GSA, obviously those are spread out among different
the fall reading, right?
no, those are the spring.
Of
Yeah, we loaded in the spring reading. So, yeah, so
Because the pilot would be started late.
fingers crossed, that number goes down.
Yeah, but if an agency were to implement the pilot before the end of the water year, do a couple auctions at the end of the water year, it would be based on the spring reading. And now, understand too, I want to communicate these triggers, these mitigation rules are pretty conservative, right? In the sense that we know the spring reading didn't capture all of the precipitation, right? So conditions are better than this, right? But this is what that decision would be based on. Other questions?
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
So if I understand this chart right, so number 5 would be a trigger. The whole district would be a trigger, even if, because you have that small little dot on the bottom of the line.
Yep. So that means here, this is the minimum threshold trigger. So they could trade with each other and they could transfer their allocation out. And in this case, they would be transferring it up gradient, right? Because in this part of the basin, the downhill gradient is towards the southwest. And so that, if, say we had market activity, and that's actually, I think, 35 right here, actually. If 35 transfer pumping to 36, they're moving pumping out of the most sensitive area, moving it to a healthier, that would be a desirable outcome where trading could actually support sustainable management. Yeah.
One more question. So right between 36 and 29, you got that small little dot. Does that trigger for those two areas because it's on the line itself?
Yeah, so that's an important question. The way we're viewing this pilot program is it's trading only within the GSA.
Yeah, and green here is mid, orange is
Oh, I see.
greater.
Okay.
And so it would, if we zoomed in, we'd have to see where that monitoring well is. Also, that one's actually above, that one's in the 20 to 50 feet category. All right, so
there's no trading between GSAs?
Nope. Not in this system. Again, start simple, learn. The other thing too is that the 3 GSAs, another thing the committee did was we put together this matrix of the different allocation systems. There are substantial differences in some areas. And so again, we want to sort of practice and learn before we move to that more complex situation.
I understand the rules.
Please.
So on 34 and looks like 39, 38, there's no circles in those areas. So what would be the trading options there? Unlimited or?
That's a good question, and what I don't know, I'm gonna turn this one on. Good question. So actually, there are representative monitoring wells there. I don't know why they didn't get captured in the, so for some reason, the spring reading didn't make it onto this data file.
Sometimes when we go, so most of those that we read is there'd be a reason why we didn't read them. So
Yeah.
you're seeing some sort of indicator why we didn't read them.
Right,
So
like, for example, orange is it was pumping and you couldn't read it because it was
Yeah.
pumping, right? So anyway, so as I recall, I think there is one trading zone or maybe two that don't have representative monitoring wells. And the next step the engineering team is going to do is decide which of the neighboring trading zones is the most similar hydrologically, and then they're going to expand it so that there will be one more, at least one more refinement of the trading zones.
And you have to go back to when we established the representative monitoring well network, which is in we actually started doing it in 2018.
Uh-huh.
And those are largely based on historical wells that we've read and we have a long history on. And over time, we've learned that those have to move to meet future demand. So we'll have to add, subtract, even within Tulare Irrigation District, we are moving our monitoring away from using wells to only dedicated monitoring wells that we can grab quality and levels off of. So within the next 10 years, all of these will actually be gone.
Oh, okay.
Cool. So spend some time with this, share your comments with us.
These are great questions. These are the things that need to be teased out ahead of when we turn the switch on. Are there any more comments or if folks have questions online? Can we unmute them, Kendra, or should we just do chat?
They can unmute themselves.
You're more than welcome to unmute and or enter something in the chat.
Am I showing the full screen? Yeah.
Well, either we thoroughly explained it or thoroughly confused with the bookends. It's really, it's a fun process, challenging. And I hope at the end of the day, we turn the switch on and there's a little bit of activity we can test this year.
Yeah.
And okay, I hate to say this, but if we find something, that's the value of the pilot program.
Yeah.
But we hope, it has the protections in place such that we're not going to see a lot of damages. The ultimate fear when I got into water marketing is, it's kind of everybody behind closed doors trading water. Then all of a sudden you get a problem. And how do you unwind that problem? Because big checks have been cut. And the only way to unwind big checks is to go to court. Once you go to court, then we're all in court. And so it just spirals. So the water market causes the Kaweah subbasin to spiral. So this was an attempt to pre-think that out such that we can do it in baby steps and get to a point where everybody has an extra tool in their toolbox, including, I know we have some environmental and disadvantaged community folks here. I personally believe they benefit from this water market in two ways. They can participate in it and receive the protections from it, but it has to be carefully done and everybody has to acknowledge that going in.
And I would add that another big goal of this, creating a formal market, right? Because there will continue, at least in two basins, there will be informal markets where there's transfers that can happen just by submitting forms to the GSA between related parties that know each other, right? Is to create a system that's convenient, where everyone is on equal footing, there's fair access, so that all of that trading activity naturally moves into this open process where there's transparency, there's information. The community can see what's happening and understand what's happening. And obviously the idea then is to make it as convenient and useful as possible so that that's where the activity will flow to.
Yeah, because East Kaweah has already had trading happen.
Necessarily, they've needed
Mandate,
right?
yeah, that they have.
Well, they set their allocation so low that some people
Right.
have no choice.
Yep. Yeah.
So on the sustainable yield of 10 acre inches on an annual basis, can you continue to make it and let it continue to grow?
Each GSA has a different rule.
Okay.
So the East Kaweah and the Greater Kaweah have leave behinds and maximums. So no. And in the Mid-kaweah, when we started out, we started with this kind of pilot concept. So we have an emergency ordinance and we're getting the rules and regulations. We're thinking of a little different concept. We're looking at a max bucket size. So you'll be able to roll it over, what we call carryover, but you'll have a maximum. So in all cases, there's a maximum.
There are limits. There are
Limits.
either time or volumetric limits.
So, to go with the thought that I was thinking about was, so in the DAC areas, if those were unlimited and DAC wanted to acquire more and more water rights or groundwater rights to improve their water situation in that particular geographic area, is that an option? Or is that
It
would that be under
is.
limits as well?
No, that's what I was looking at in the disadvantaged community realm. For instance, Tulare Irrigation District is working with Okieville to build a recharge basin. And currently, out of practice, we're going to apply TID water rights to that basin, right, and recharge. However, there's an opportunity there. If the community wanted to purchase water and put it in that bay, we would do it on their behalf. And it looks odd, right? Because how can a disadvantaged community, but if, again, when you put everybody in it together and you add $1, everybody puts $1, all of a sudden you're moving water into, right? And we would go out on the open market on behalf of Okieville and park it in there. So you're right. And the water market, and Okieville could then decide that's theirs. If they wanted to sell it to a farmer next door because they had so much and it actually is working and the mound is up, you actually want to pump it down to exercise it to a certain extent. The idea with that is that then you look at that revenue, and that's the revenue to fund the O&M of their ongoing systems, right? Which is always a challenge in some of these communities. So, and the irrigation district is looking at, we look to that in the future, but right now it's just about getting water underneath the community. That's priority number one.
Yeah.
And I know on the other side of that equation, from the environmental community, we've talked to Sequoia Riverlands Trust. They have a lot of land that is right along rivers. And so they're the prime candidate for the put. And in certain circumstances, again, it benefits those areas where the growers around the outside can work with Sequoia Riverlands Trust in a partnership, sharing that water supply and the revenue.
Oh, okay.
There's also a number of water markets now. An emerging market strategy in the Western United States is there's groups that will also buy allocation for nature to permanently retire it, right? They'll buy allocation either to maintain stream flows when fish are migrating or to just buy down irrigation to support groundwater dependent ecosystems, that kind of stuff. So there are a number of other and this would have to be a later iteration where literally the environment can benefit directly from market activity.
You pointed out too, one of the principles is that in order to buy or sell credits within the subbasin, you have to own land. So it's, again, you recognize it's tied to an APN. So an investor from, who knows where can't come in and start buying in the market. You wouldn't have access to it.
But a local land trust could, for example.
Well, it's all part of the repurposing of land too. It's, if you want to repurpose your land to do whatever, then that frees up water. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Kaweah Oaks Preserve, but all those, that's a preserve that's out on 198. And all those really, really, really hundreds of year-old oak trees were all dying. And we didn't know what to do. I mean, there wasn't any well water, that we could begin to figure out how to do it. And we were approached by Kaweah Delta saying, oh my God, we've got all this extra water, we've got to dump it somewhere. And we had a place to dump it. And now if you drive by there, I mean, it makes me cry. All those oak trees are so happy. So it's a win-win. And it turns out that the groundwater recharge is way better than anybody, including the scientists, thought would happen. So you're getting recharge, the trees are happy, and it's a public benefit for all the people in the community. So
please, if anybody, again, we offer this second chance if you're too shy to ask a question or can't, are you driving away and go, oh, shoot.
8:30?
It makes me feel young again to go back to office hours in college. Coming up next week, it's been sometimes attended very well and other times we're just sitting there, these
Well,
us water.
we've never had fewer than one, but we did have one person that asked
Oh,
us, hey, just go through the presentation again. I want to talk through it with you. Yeah. So we have no agenda. You can come in with questions, you can come with comments. You can say, hey, let's talk through that part of the presentation again.
Sorry, there's two questions. Yes, they said.
And we also have a hand raise.
Great.
So let's start with the. There's one in Spanish. Oh, why?
The translators are working on it.
Oh, they are. Okay, so let's start with the second question is, now it disappeared. Oh, is the water dash, people are adding is the water dashboard view that shows allocations by parcel live for all GSAs? I'm not seeing that view on my, so I would, John, you're right. That's not necessarily active in all GSAs yet, but it's coming. So they're working on the east and the greater as we speak.
But it is live in mid currently.
In mid, yes.
So that gives you a sense of where greater and east are headed, right?
Correct.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, thanks. Christina was just raising her hand to highlight that there are questions.
Cool.
So there's a question in Spanish. Is that coming? Can the translator give that verbally or is that being typed in?
We're working on it.
Okay.
You want me to read it?
That'd be awesome.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
This is your final exam. She's taking, she said she's taking real Spanish versus her Cali Spanish.
Well, she said that she doesn't know why we would need to sell and trade water. So she's a little confused.
Okay. Great question.
And then yeah, so it was a statement. She said she doesn't understand why we would need to sell and trade water when really the root of the issue is that communities need water that's clean, sustainable, portable, accessible.
100% agree. Yeah. So an example of where a transfer of water might make a lot of sense is, a grower, growers have to make water use decisions with imperfect information. They don't know what the precipitation is, et cetera, right? They could get a very typical example, very common one in other water markets is that a grower gets to the end of the water year and realizes, oh no, despite my best planning, I went 15 acre feet over my allocation. I'm going to pay penalties, right? And so in the old model, they would just have to pay the penalties and the overage would persist, right? When a market recognizes, hey, wouldn't it be beneficial if they paid somebody else to pump less so that the total amount of pumping was in balance, right? So the old system with no trading, people pay the penalties and the sustainable yield is exceeded. The idea here is people who are a little bit over can pay someone to pump a little less so that the total amount of pumping is in balance. That's the idea. And that's an agricultural case that's actually very, very common.
And Maria, I would say in the Kaweah subbasin, it's a very poignant question. And it's important. The Sustainable Groundwater Management Act came into fruition in 2014, recognizing that we are over pumping our groundwater. So we are in the process of cutting back how much groundwater we're pumping, but that's balanced against who we are as a community, and we are an agricultural community. So we have to share in that burden of cutting back. We're trying to do that without collapsing our economies. The water market tries to recognize in that cutback, there will be people that will have to be hurt and people that will be able to survive. And if we can share that revenue, keep our economies moving a little bit better. If we just took a hard cutback and everybody stopped pumping and agricultural disappeared to the extent of 25% or more, our economies are anticipated to take a pretty big hit. And that to our GSA was probably one of its prime reasons for all of the decisions we make, is to try and preserve the economy while cutting back on the resource and preserving as much agriculture as.
Yeah, I think you should also explain the whole Okieville and how you're doing a recharge basin to put water underneath. Because what she's saying is that lots of communities don't have that. I know her personally. She talks a lot about water quality underneath disadvantaged communities, and we are doing a project with Okieville to put some nice fresh water down there.
Yeah, that's a good point, Diana. We, in the Mid-kaweah, we recognize that water quality goes hand in hand. You can't ignore one without the water levels, but there was a point in time where we recognized that if we don't focus and concentrate on water levels, water quality of a dry well is of no concern. It's just disaster at that point. So what we've decided to do is to take a look at ways we can improve water quality by using the high water quality or the good water quality of our surface water. So we're going to around our disadvantaged communities, the ones that can't hook up to cities like Tulare, and doing groundwater recharge around them. And the goal there is to not only bring the groundwater level up, but to replace or dilute the bad water with good clean water. So that basin's just been awarded for contract. Obviously, we were hoping to build it this year, but it's really wet, so it's awarded. It should be constructed by the end of the year, and we'll begin to put recharge water in there as soon as we can. So that will flow underneath the community of Okieville.
Yeah.
So, thank you. Anybody else?
Awesome. Well, we look forward to seeing you at our office hours, and then we'll be hanging around here for a little bit, so don't be shy. Come up, say hi, feel free to ask questions or make comments to us individually as well. So thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.